At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFI without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's I Am Duck. Let's begin.
The air in the forward command bunker carried the bitter tang of stimulant residue. Corporal Eric Thane leaned against the damp permacrete wall, folding his arms as the briefing's monotonous drone washed over him. He'd heard this speech before, on other worlds, in other bunkers, from different commanders who thought shouting made a bad plan better. The names and species changed, but the plan was always a funeral dirge played at march tempo. Prefect Hadrian Tell stood before the holographic map, a scarred, grey mountain of muscle packed into an officer's uniform. He was a Carnosian traditionalist, one who treated willpower as a cudgel for every problem. He scanned the 12th Assault Company's assembled officers, a mixed unit of Carnosians, a few specialists from smaller coalition species, and one human in the command group, Thane. The objective is the Crike fortification designated The Roost. Tell's voice was a low rumble that vibrated in the floor plates. He gestured with a thick, three-fingered hand at the glowing red citadel on the map. High Command's intel confirms its plasma cannons are the primary obstacle to our sector-wide advance. We will remove this obstacle. Thane shifted his weight, determined. That was a word bureaucrats used when they'd run out of ideas. The plan is a direct frontal assault, Tell continued. The words were an execution order. First wave will absorb their initial volley and establish a foothold at the Mesa's base. Second wave, which we will lead, will exploit the breach and push into the complex. A young Carnosian captain, his hide smooth aside from the scars of a few campaigns, shifted his massive frame. Prefect, with respect, our numbers in the first echelon. The opening volley will shred them. We'll be sending them to their deaths before we can even achieve a breach. The projections are acceptable, Captain. Tell cut him off. The prefect looked over and stared at Thane. Some have noted the low concussive tolerance of certain species in our ranks. Resolve must be absolute. One broken link, and the chain fails. Thane held his ground under the prefect's stare. This again. He'd been the unit's human mascot for 3 months, a living reminder of why the hulking Carnosians did the heavy lifting. He was a curiosity, a specimen of a species known for its clever technology and questionable stamina. The words slipped out, a low murmur just loud enough to carry. It's the Aracosian maneuver. Standard textbook from a millennium ago. The Crike probably use it for training simulations. The droning stopped. Every officer turned. The Carnosian next to him, a mountain of a private named Galt, stiffened. The prefect snapped his head around, his amber gaze pinning Thane to the wall. Corporal Thane, Tell's voice lowered, each word a chip of ice. You have a tactical observation to share with the company? Thane straightened up from the wall. The exhaustion in his bones was still there, but he pushed it down. No, Prefect, just admiring the simplicity. It's elegant. Tell's jaw muscles bunched. Your species finds humor in strange places. You see simplicity. I see directness. I see the application of an overwhelming force, a concept I fear your people misunderstood. He stepped away from the map, his boots thudding on the mental floor. He stopped directly in front of Thane, close enough that the human had to crane his neck to meet Carnosian's gaze. Tell raised his voice to address the entire room. Your frames have a low tolerance for concussive force. Your stamina depletes rapidly under sustained fire. You are a tactical liability, Corporal, and morale is paramount before a charge. Therefore, a demonstration is in order to prove to every soldier here the superiority of Carnosian discipline and strength. A knot formed in Thane's stomach. This was more than a reprimand. This was theatre, and he was the main event. A demonstration? Thane asked, his voice flat. Indeed, Tal said, a faint, cruel smile forming. We will put your elegance to test. The 12th Company's grim, expectant faces surrounded the training pit, a circle of packed dirt. Prefect Tal stood on the pit's edge like a priest at a ritual sacrifice. In combat there must be certainty, Tal announced to the assembled soldiers. You must have faith in the strength of your comrade. Today we will reaffirm that faith. He gestured into the pit. Private Gelt, my best pupil. Gelt stepped forward. He was a magnificent example of his species. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, his grey hide rippling with muscle, honed by life on a world with twice Kretus's gravity. His steps were deliberate and powerful, each one planted as if to shake the ground. He wore only simple training trousers, his chest and arms bare. Tal stared at Thane again. Corporal, the pit. Thane unclipped his gear belt and dropped it on the ground. He handed his pulse rifle to a human tech who fumbled with it. He walked down the short ramp into the pit, the mud sucking at his boots. 100 soldiers watched him, most of them Carnosian, all expecting a quick, brutal lesson in human frailty. He rolled his shoulders and stretched his neck, the joints popping. He was giving away at least 500 pounds and 3 feet in height. This was objectively a terrible idea. Gelt stood in the pit's center, settling into a traditional Carnosian combat stance. Legs wide, one massive arm guarding high, the other coiled low, ready to strike. The posture was all about power and forward pressure, his body rooted to the spot. Yield, Corporal. Gelt's voice was a deep baritone, more respectful than his prefects. Acknowledging a physical disparity shows wisdom. I hope to avoid injuring you before the battle. Thane just offered a thin smile. Appreciate the concern, Private. He kept his stance loose and relaxed, bouncing on the balls of his feet. He tracked Gelt's shoulders, hips, and posture. Tal boomed from the edge. Begin. Gelt lunged, his size belying his explosive speed. The ground shook as he closed the distance in 2 massive strides, lashing out with his coiled arm in a blow that could buckle a blast door. Thane turned with the attack, pivoting on his left foot just enough for the Carnosian's fist to punch through the air, where his head was an instant before. The wind from the blow ruffled his hair. Inside Gelt's long reach, the Carnosian's size became a disadvantage. He tried to bring his other arm around in a sweeping club-like motion. Thane ducked under it. He drove his shoulder hard into Gelt's laid knee. The impact felt like hitting a support pillar, but the blow was enough. The joint buckled from the unexpected lateral force. Gelt grunted, his perfect stance broken as he stumbled to regain his balance. Thane surged forward, getting behind the stumbling giant. He snaked his right arm under Gelt's armpit and locked his hands behind the Carnosian's neck in a brutal clinch. At the same time, he hooked his leg around Gelt's ankle, pulling down with all his might, and kicked the leg out. Simple physics. Leverage. A smaller force applied at the right point to redirect a much larger one. Gelt's center of gravity, already compromised, vanished. For a moment, the massive Carnosian seemed suspended in the air. He stared, his amber eyes wide with disbelief. Then, gravity took over. Gelt crashed onto his back with a deep, percussive thump that echoed across the training yard. The impact knocked the wind out of him with a loud grunt of shock and pain. Before Gelt could even process what had happened, Thane planted his knee firmly on the Carnosian's chest, his forearm pressed against his throat. The entire company stared, 100 jaws slack with disbelief. They had just watched the human topple their champion. Prefect Tal stared, his expression hardening to stone. He looked from the downed Gelt to the human standing over him. The commander's mouth a thin line. Thane took the pressure off Gelt's throat and stood up. He looked down at the winded Carnosian who blinked up at the grey sky, his mind still catching up to his body. Thane extended a hand. Gelt considered it for a long moment. Then his massive 3-fingered hand enveloped Thane's. He accepted the help up. As he got to his feet, he towered over the human once again, He regarded Thane, his anger and shame giving way to a dawning respect. "You are fast," Galt rumbled, rotating his shoulder. Thane clapped him on the arm. The muscle was unyielding. "You're plenty fast yourself, big guy." The mess hall buzzed with the low chatter of 100 anxious soldiers, trying to forget the morning's briefing. Carnosians tended to eat with the same focused intensity they applied to everything else. The clatter of metal trays and utensils was deafening. Thane sat alone at a small table in the corner, working his way through a nutrient bar, a dense brick of cultured microprotein and synthesized protein that tasted of salt and boiled yeast. He preferred to be alone before big push. Solitude helped him keep his thoughts in order. A large shadow fell over his table. He looked up to see Galt holding a tray piled high with rations, enough to feed a small family. The other Carnosians in the hall watched, giving the two of them a wide berth. "May I join you, Corporal?" Galt asked formally. "It's a free country, or planet, whatever," Thane said, gesturing to the empty bench with his fork. Galt sat, the bench groaning in protest under his weight. He placed his tray down and studied Thane for a moment, his gaze unblinking. "You must explain the technique you employed. My instructor spoke of using an opponent's mass against him, but I have only ever seen it applied in slow, deliberate forms." Thane swallowed a mouthful of his ration bar. "Leverage and biomechanics, basic physics." He picked up a salt dispenser. "You're the dispenser. Big, stable, hard to move if I push you head on." He demonstrated by pressing his finger against the metal, which barely budged. "But if I get under your center of gravity and apply force at an unexpected point," he tipped the container onto its side with a flick of his finger, "you go down." Galt considered this, his brow furrowed. "You exploit weakness." "Everyone has weaknesses," Thane said. "Joints that only bend one way, a dependence on balance. We've had a long history of fighting things bigger than us, usually other humans. You learn to work smarter, applying force where it's most effective." The big Carnosian took a massive bite of his ration block and chewed, his gaze distant. "The prefect's plan," he said after a moment, his voice low. "It feels like brute force. It is overwhelming force." Thane stopped eating and studied Galt. Galt's gaze held a capacity for thought that went beyond the simple warrior dogma Tell espoused. "It's a classic meat grinder," Thane said, his voice low. "He's planning to soften them up with our bodies, so the next division can walk in and plant a flag. We're just ammunition, the expendable portion." Galt's formal demeanor cracked, his brow furrowed. "To die in battle is an honor, but to be thrown away, that is a different matter. Welcome to the service, kid," Thane said, a grim smirk on his face. They finished their meal in silence, two soldiers from different ends of the coalition, thinking about the battle to come. As they got up to leave, Galt placed a hand on Thane's shoulder, its weight immense. "Tomorrow on the field," Galt said, his voice a low, serious rumble. "I will fight beside you. I will watch your back." Thane looked up at him. The resolve in the Carnosian's eyes was clear. He clinked his empty canteen against the massive armor plate on Galt's chest. "Back at you, big guy." The whistle was a thin, sharp scream that cut through the thunder of the bombardment. This was the signal, the starting pistol for a race everyone dreaded. Thane took a deep breath of trench air. "Showtime," he muttered. He went over the top, scrambling up the muddy wall into the churned wasteland. Galt was beside him, a bulwark of armor. Plasma bolts and artillery shells turned the field into a churned hellscape of sound and fire. Kretus's scarred landscape was a ruin of craters and shattered, blackened trees. The ground itself seemed to boil as the Crike answered the Coalition's artillery with their own. Streaks of white-hot energy hissed through the air, illuminating the morning mist. A Carnosian to Thane's left screamed as a bolt hit him square in the chest. His personal energy shield flared violently. A bubble of coruscating light held for a fraction of a second and then collapsed. The plasma cooked him inside his own armor. He dropped, his armor clattering. "Stay close," Galt bellowed over the din. Galt moved, then planted his feet. Thane dropped to a knee behind him and fired. They repeated the sequence, a rhythm of desperation. Galt became a mobile wall. He'd plant his feet, his heavy Carnosian plating absorbing impacts that would vaporize Thane's lighter gear. The plasma sizzled against his shield, each hit making him grunt with the effort of staying upright. Behind this living bulwark, Thane knelt, his pulse rifle steady. He chose his targets with care, laying down tight, controlled bursts of suppressive fire at the enemy, emplacements on the distant mesa. A Crike heavy repeater nest spat a torrent of red energy bolts. Thane saw the gunner's distinctive, loping silhouette. The Crike were unnerving creatures vaguely avian in posture, but with the wiry, tenacious build of carrion eaters. Their movements were a series of abrupt, unpredictable twitches. Thane squeezed the trigger. 3 blue bolts of plasma crossed the battlefield, and the Crike gunner jerked and fell from its perch. "Good shooting, Eric," Galt roared. They made progress, a slow, brutal crawl from crater to crater. They were among the few teams in the first echelon to make it halfway to the objective. The dead and dying of their company littered the field around them. The prefect's grand charge had broken against the Crike's fortified line. They took cover in the lee of a wrecked coalition transport. Thane's hands were slick with sweat as he slapped a fresh power cell into his rifle. Galt leaned against the metal, breathing heavily, his shield flickering weakly as it tried to recharge. "Their fire is too concentrated," Galt said. "Their fire has us pinned." "Then we dig in and wait for—" A high-pitched whine cut Thane's sentence short. Crescendoing above them, an artillery shell. He could only tense for the impact. The world exploded in a cataclysm of light, sound, and pressure. The explosion tossed the wrecked transport into the air. A concussive blast slammed into Thane, and the universe dissolved into roaring, agonizing blackness. Thane woke to a high-pitched whine in his skull. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the battle noise. A concussive rhythm throbbed behind his eyes. He tasted blood and dirt. He pushed himself up, half buried in mud and twisted metal. Night had fallen. Crestus's twin moons cast a faint light over the battlefield. The air was cold, thick with the smell of burnt metal and cooked meat. The fighting was over. Looking back towards his own lines, he could see the distant faint glow of their position, miles away. The assault had failed. A wave of panic threatened to choke him, but he forced it down. Assess. Survive. He did a quick systems check. His suit's diagnostic showed multiple microfractures in his helmet and a drained shield emitter, but his vitals were stable. Bruises covered him from head to toe, and a splitting headache pulsed behind his eyes, but he was alive. "Galt?" he croaked, his voice raw. His call was swallowed by the quiet. He scrambled from the debris, his movements clumsy. The battlefield was a carnal house. The bodies of Carnosian soldiers lay strewn across the landscape, their formidable armor breached and blackened. He found Galt a few yards away, pinned beneath a heavy sheet of the transport hull. Only his legs and one arm were visible. Thane's breath hitched. He grabbed the metal plate's edge. The weight was immense. He grunted, straining. His muscles burned in protest. The plate shifted an inch. "Come on, you big bastard!" he gasped, putting his back into it. With a final desperate heave, the metal sheet tilted and slid off, crashing into the mud. Galt clung to life. Shredded armor exposed his torso. A jagged piece of shrapnel the size of Thane's form jutted from his side. A brutal, ugly wound that had bypassed the thickest part of his plating. Dark Carnosian blood, viscous and almost black in the moonlight, soaked the ground around him. Thane ripped open his midkit. "Hang on, buddy. Just hang on." He grabbed the applicator for the biofoam, the military's field solution for catastrophic trauma. He jammed it against the wound and flooded the area with the rapidly expanding sealant. The foam hissed as it made contact, hardening into a temporary, sterile plug. Galt's eyelids fluttered open. Pain glazed his eyes. Thane, I'm here, Thane said, working fast as he checked for other injuries. Save your strength. Yeah, stay quiet. He checked his comms. Static. The Crike would be using jammers, mopping up survivors. They were utterly alone deep inside enemy territory, and his friend was dying. They found shelter in a depression deep enough to hide them from casual observation. Thane managed to drag Galt into its relative safety, an act which left him trembling with exhaustion. He propped the massive Carnosian against the crater wall, trying to make him as comfortable as possible. The biofoam had stopped the external bleeding, but the internal damage was too severe. Galt was fading. The slow, rhythmic rasp of his breathing was the only sound in the hollow. "You know," Galt whispered, his voice a faint rumble, "you still owe me a rematch. This time, a straight fight." Thane forced a smile, though it felt brittle on his face. "Sure thing. As soon as we get you to a real medic. You can name the terms. We'll keep it to upper body." Galt managed a weak, wet chuckle, which turned into a cough. He looked up at the unfamiliar stars of Kretus. "I doubt I will be collecting on that debt." Thane waited. The only sound was the slow, wet rasp of Galt's breathing. The rite of dust," Galt said, his breathing becoming shallower. "A Carnosian warrior's body must return to his clan. They will render it to ash and give it back to the soil of his homeworld. It ensures the spirit finds its way to the ancestral field." "You'll get there, Galt," Thane said, his voice thick. "We'll get you back." "No," Galt stated, a surprising firmness in his tone. "But you can. Keep the scavengers off me, Eric. The Crike, they take trophies." The thought seemed to cause him more pain than his wound. "Promise me. You will take me home." Thane looked at his friend. This giant of a man who was a stranger a day ago. A profound, aching grief settled over him. "Hook, I promise," Thane's voice broke. "I'll get you home." Galt's features relaxed. He seemed to focus on something far away. He managed a weak smile. Then, with a final shuddering sigh, he went still. Thane sat in the suffocating dark of the depression. He sat with his friend's body for a long time, watching as the twin moons tracked across the sky and the first hints of a grey, indifferent dawn painted the eastern horizon. He could leave, travel light. His chances of survival would improve, but a promise was a promise, a piece of solid ground in a world of mud and blood. He stood up, his body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. He looked at Galt's immense form. He gripped the corpse to lift it, muscle screaming, but its inertia held it fast in the mud. He spent an hour in grim preparation. He stripped Galt of all superfluous gear, every spare clip, each personal effect, anything that added mass. He muttered a quiet apology. "Gotta make the weight, big guy." The arid Cretan air would have to do the rest. He began the grim task of stripping off Galt's heavy ferroceramic armor plates. Each one was a dead weight. He laid them out on the ground. Then an idea took shape, born of desperation and the human instinct to build, to solve. He found a thick, sturdy branch from a shattered tree nearby. He took the two largest chest plates and lashed them to the branch, using scavenged straps from his own gear and Galt's pack. The result was crude and ugly, but functional. A travois, a sled for the dead. He rolled Galt's body onto the makeshift platform and secured it tightly. He fashioned a harness for himself, looping straps over his shoulders and around his waist. He clipped the rigging to the sled's front. He took a deep breath and leaned into the harness, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The weight was monstrous. His body screamed, his joints popped. The travois shifted, groaning, and slid a few inches forward. Thane clenched his jaw, the muscles in his neck cording. He looked back at the coalition lines, a faint smudge on the horizon. 40 miles, he figured, maybe 60 on the ground. A lifetime. "Okay, big guy," he muttered to the still form. "Let's go home." Thane's body, conditioned for the quick, explosive movements of combat, protested the slow, grinding torture of dragging the travois. The harness straps cut into his shoulders, raw and chafing. The unrelenting inertia of Galt's body was a constant, malevolent force he had to overcome with every single step. He developed a rhythm. 10 paces, stop. Gasp for breath, 10 more paces. The landscape was a constant obstacle. A gentle slope became a mountain. A patch of soft mud became a mire threatening to claim his burden. He had to navigate around deep craters and through thickets of razor-sharp shattered trees, the travois snagging on every obstacle. On the second day, a Crike patrol appeared, 4 of them loping across a distant ridge. They scanned the battlefield for salvage or survivors. Thane froze. He ducked into a shallow ditch, pulling the travois down with him. His friend's dead weight pressed him into the cold, damp mud. He lay there holding his breath, listening to the squelch of their footsteps as they passed less than 100 yards away. Their scent, a dry, dusty odor of old bones and carrion, drifted on the wind. He stayed hidden for a full hour after they vanished, a frantic, panicked rhythm in his chest. The days melted into a routine of torment. Drag, hide, sleep, repeat. He moved mostly at night, using the twin moons for light. His world shrank to the few feet of ground in front of him, the burning in his legs and back, and the constant dragging weight behind him. His rations ran out on day 5. He started foraging, a dangerous prospect on a war-torn alien world. The arid climate helped in one grim aspect. Each day, the body on the travois grew lighter. He found some tough, tuberous roots that tasted like dirt but filled his stomach. Water was a constant problem. He used his standard-issue purifier to drink from stagnant puddles in shell craters. The filters indicate a light. Once a healthy green, turned yellow, then flickered an ominous orange. Time was running out. Galt was his constant companion. The silence of his presence was heavier than his mass. Thane found himself talking to him, quiet, one-sided conversations. "Remember that briefing, big guy?" he'd pant, leaning against a rock, his lungs burning. "Telling he's an overwhelming force. Look how that turned out." The body, wrapped in a scavenged top, remained still, but speaking kept the madness at bay. For now. He'd walked for nearly 2 weeks. Or was it 3? He'd lost track. His uniform was in tatters, his face a gaunt mask of dirt and exhaustion. He topped a low rise and stopped, blinking in a narrow canyon whose magnetic ore deposits likely scrambled artillery guidance systems. A farm huddled. A simple homestead with a low-slung dwelling and a tall cylindrical silo. A small pocket of civilization in a world dedicated to war. Movement, life. Caution screamed at him, but desperation was louder. He needed food, he needed clean water. He left the travois hidden in a thicket and crept down towards the farmstead, his rifle at the ready. He found the family hiding in the silo. He'd broken the lock on the door, and the sound had sent them scurrying into the shadows. 2 adults and a small child. They were Cressian, a species he'd only read about in coalition briefings. Tall and impossibly slender, with limbs that moved with a fluid, boneless quality. Large, dark eyes stood out on their slender faces, and their long fingers looked too delicate for this harsh world. Pacifists. Their people had forsworn violence centuries ago. The male, Talus, held a long curved farming tool like a makeshift spear, placing himself between Thane and his family. The tool shook in his grip, but his eyes were resolute. "We have little of value," Talus said, his voice a soft, melodic baritone. Thane held up his hands, showing they were empty. "I mean you no harm. I just need food." The female Yenna peeked out from behind her mate. Her gaze went past Thane, up the hill towards the thicket where he'd left the travois. A corner of the top was visible. She registered the unmistakable shape of the lodged body beneath it. Her expression softened. She placed a gentle hand on Talus's arm. He is on a pilgrimage, my love. Look at him. Talus followed her gaze. He took in the filth and exhaustion on Thane's hollowed face, the soldier underneath, and the man carrying a heavy burden. He lowered his weapon. They gave him water, clean and cool from their well. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. They gave him food, a bowl of steamed native vegetables that was so full of flavor it made him want to weep. They offered him kindness. "You should bury your friend here," Talus said as Thane finished the meal. "There's good soil. Let him rest. The journey's killing you. Save yourself. Let the dead rest." Thane looked at his hands, calloused and torn from the harness. He thought of Gelt's last request. The weight of his promise. "I can't," he said, his voice low but firm. "I made a promise." Yenna and Talus exchanged a look of sad comprehension. The Crike came in the middle of the night. Thane was asleep in the silo, the first real sleep he'd had in weeks, when the sound of their skittering movements outside jolted him awake. He grabbed his rifle, 5 of them, a kill squad, moving with predatory confidence, likely drawn by the farm's light or the simple fact that it remained standing. The Crescian family huddled in the corner, shaking. Talus looked at Thane, his eyes wide. Thane put a finger to his lips, then pointed for them to hide behind a stack of storage containers. He had 10 rounds left in his rifle's power cell. His body, already past its limits, screamed at the prospect of a firefight. Sheer brutality was his only option. The first Crike kicked the silo door open and stepped inside, its weapon sweeping the darkness. The doorway framed it, silhouetted against the moonlight. Thane was already moving. He surged from the shadows. He slammed the butt of his rifle into the creature's knee, shattering the joint with a sickening crack. As the Crike shrieked and fell, Thane drove the barrel up under its jaw and pulled the trigger. The plasma bolt blew the top of its head off, in a flash of blue light and vaporized gore. 2 more scrambled into the silo, the shriek alerting them. Thane dropped his empty rifle and grabbed the nearest weapon, a heavy 3-pronged pitchfork leaning against the wall. He met their charge with a roar. He was an animal, cornered and fighting for his life. He parried a clumsy bayonet thrust with the wooden shaft of the pitchfork and drove the steel tines deep into the second Crike's chest. The creature gurgled, clawing at the prongs, embedded in its torso, and collapsed. The third one fired its plasma pistol. The shot went wide in the close quarters, scorching a black scar on the silo wall. Thane kicked a heavy wrench from their floor into his hand and threw it with all his might. The heavy tool spun, end over end, and struck the Crike on the side of its head with a crunch of bone. It dropped and lay still. The remaining 2 outside began firing into the silo. Thane grabbed the corpse of the first Crike and used its limb as a gruesome club, smashing a nearby lantern and plunging the silo into shadow. He moved silently between the stacks of supplies. He hunted them in the dark, a predator on his own terms. A shriek, cut short. Another followed. Then the silo fell quiet. A few moments later, Thane limped back into the center of the structure. Alien blood, a dark, oily fluid that stank of rust, covered him. He panted, leaning on the pitchfork, adrenaline the only thing holding him upright. The Crescian family emerged from their hiding place. They stared at him, their large eyes wide with awe and terror. Talus stepped forward, his fear giving way to a somber respect. "You have saved us." "They'll send more," Thane gasped, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving a deep, trembling exhaustion in its wake. "You have to leave. Now." Talus nodded. Before they fled into the night, they gave Thane everything they could spare. A full water bladder, a sack of dried roots, and a thick, sturdy canvas to better wrap Gelt's body. Yenna pointed him towards a faint path winding through the hills. It was a longer route, she explained, but it might help him avoid the Crike patrols that stuck to the valleys. They parted ways in the gloom before dawn, 2 separate sets of refugees, fleeing the same relentless war. The new path was harder, steeper, The extra food and water helped, but his body was starting to break down in earnest. He was a machine with failing parts. Malnourishment, dehydration, and the unending exhaustion were eroding his body and his mind. The edges of reality frayed. Flickers of movement in his peripheral vision, whispers on the wind that sounded like his name, and then, Gelt. He was hauling the travois up a steep, rocky incline when he looked over and saw the big Carnosian walking beside him, whole and uninjured, clad in his dress uniform. He looked magnificent. "You are a stubborn creature, Eric Thane," the phantom Gelt said, his voice the same deep baritone Thane remembered. Thane kept hauling, unsurprised. "Tell me something new," he grunted, leaning into the harness. "You have done enough," the hallucination said. "You have honored your promise. My spirit is free from this flesh. It is free. Let me go, Eric. It is my time. Save yourself." Thane's cracked lips pulled back in a grimace. "Shut up," he growled, his voice a raw croak. "You're heavy enough as it is." The phantom Gelt smiled, a sad, affectionate expression. "As you wish, my friend. But at least be careful. This is a hunter's ridge." Thane scanned the terrain ahead of an ingrained instinct and caught it. A tiny manufactured glint of light on the crest of the adjacent ridge, the sun reflecting off something that was out of place, a weapon scope. A memory surfaced, Gelt's voice from a long-ago patrol. "A hunter's trick. We learned to watch for that in my homeworld." His exhausted brain had just served up the memory, triggered by animal instinct. He dove for cover, dragging the travois with him behind a cluster of rocks, just as a searing bolt of plasma sizzled through the air where his head was. It struck the rock face behind him, exploding in a shower of superheated stone. The shock of the near miss snapped him back to a sharper reality. He looked around. The phantom Gelt had vanished. He was alone again, with a real sniper hunting him. The sniper pinned him down. On the 19th day, his water purifier died. The indicator light went dark. He was down to the last few sips in his bladder. This ridge was the final obstacle. The Crike sniper had the high ground and a perfect field of fire. Every time Thane so much as shifted, a plasma bolt would kick up dirt near his position. Trapped, too weak to make a run for it, too exposed to fight back effectively. He would die here, on this barren ridge miles from anywhere, his promise a dead weight on his soul. Despair settled over him. He lay there as the hours passed, the sun crawling across the sky. His strength failed, his resolve giving way to exhaustion. But as dusk settled, casting long shadows across the canyon, a final desperate idea sparked in his weary mind. A gamble. He waited until the light was poor, the shadows deep and confusing. With the last dregs of his strength, he untied Gelt's body from the travois. He grunted and strained, muscles tearing, and propped the canvas-wrapped form up against a tall boulder at the edge of his cover. In the dim light it looked like a large soldier peering over the rock, a perfect target. He crawled to the other side of his cover, his own pulse rifle ready. He fumbled for his medkit, jamming his last stimulant injector into his thigh. The chemical fire brought 30 seconds of cold clarity. It would be enough. He laid the rifle on a flat stone, steadying his trembling hands. Then he waited. He prayed the Crike was arrogant or bored. He got his answer moments later. A single plasma bolt flashed across the twilight, striking Gelt's body square in the chest. The canvas smoked, the impact knocking the corpse backward. But the muzzle flash, a brief, brilliant star in the growing darkness, had given away the sniper's position. Thane stared at the spot. He pointed his rifle at the location and fired a short, controlled 3-round burst. The blue plasma bolts traced a path across the gloom. He stared at the sniper's nest. The enemy fire ceased. The threat vanished. The effort had cost him everything. The rifle slipped from his numb fingers. A wave of blackness washed over him. He stumbled forward, out of cover. Grabbing the harness of the travois, he could see them, the distant electric glow of the Coalition's perimeter fence. Less than a mile. The last mile. He fell, crawled, and dragged his burden yard by agonizing yard. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. The world was a smear of grey dirt and distant lights. His promise was a single word, a mantra he repeated with every ragged breath. Home, home, home. He collapsed at the edge of the trench line, his body giving out. He could only crawl, digging his fingers into the mud, pulling himself and the immense weight behind him forward, 1 inch at a time. Prefect Hadrian Tell stood on the parapet of the forward trench, staring out into the darkness. A sentry had reported movement, a single figure crawling towards their lines, dragging something large. Tell expected a deserter, or perhaps a lone wounded survivor driven mad by the failed assault. He raised his magnoculars, prepared for disappointment. The lenses focused. The figure was human, skeletal. He was a stranger, caked in so much filth and dried blood. Tell's processors cross-referenced the tattered uniform's insignia. Corporal Thane, a statistical anomaly. His file listed him as killed in action weeks ago. And the thing he was dragging, the thing was a body, wrapped in canvas, strapped to a crude sled of armored plates. The size and shape were unmistakable, a Carnosian. Tell lowered the magnoculars. It couldn't be. Medics scrambled over the parapet. As Thane breached the perimeter, he collapsed in a heap, his journey at an end. He was clinging to consciousness, his eyes rolled back in his head. But as the medics reached for him, he pushed them away with a feeble hand. He fumbled at the canvas wrap on the body, his fingers clumsy and weak. He pulled a set of dog tags free. Prefect Tell had walked down from the parapet and now stood over him. The entire outpost silent, watching the scene unfold under the harsh glare of the perimeter lights. The Carnosian soldiers, his soldiers, looked on, their expressions stunned and reverent. Thane pushed himself up onto one elbow. He looked up at the towering Carnosian commander, the one who had called him weak, a liability. He held out the dog tags. Tell took them. He read the name stamped into the metal. Private Galt. I made a promise, Thane whispered, and then he passed out. Prefect Tell stared down at the human. He glanced at the dog tags in his hand. He stared at the body of his finest student, a warrior this frail creature had dragged for weeks, across miles of enemy territory, an act of loyalty and endurance so profound it bordered on the sacred. Everything he understood about strength, about honor, about the nature of a warrior crumbled. He had sent his soldiers to die with overwhelming force. This human had survived with overwhelming will. He turned to the chief medic, his voice containing a quality he'd rarely used. Awe. You will give this human the best care we have. You will treat him with the highest honors. He then looked at his assembled officers, a new shattering clarity in his amber eyes. And prepare the rite of dust for the warrior he returned to us.